It was just an old mirror. Dusty. Unmoving. Something her grandmother had told her never to touch. But after the funeral, Amelia stood in front of it and realized the silence in the house felt different now. Not empty, but waiting. Behind that mirror was a door. Behind the door, a room. And inside that room, a truth her family had buried for decades. Before we dive in, if stories mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. At first, the house didn't feel strange, just quiet. Amelia arrived 3 days after the funeral, suitcase in hand, unsure how long she'd stay. The porch steps creaked beneath her, same as they had when she was small. Paint peeled from the railing. The wind tugged gently at the curtains in the front window. Inside, it smelled the same. Old books, floor polish, a faint trace of her grandmother's perfume that seemed to cling to the walls. She moved slowly from room to room, careful not to disturb anything. The house hadn't changed much. The same worn rug in the hallway, the same framed embroidery above the mantel, even the same ticking clock in the kitchen, slow by 2 minutes. But it was the bedroom that made her pause. The door stood ajar unusual. Her grandmother never allowed it. She stepped in, hesitant. The bed was neatly made, pill bottles untouched, a Bible on the nightstand, beside folded glasses. And there it was, the mirror. Tall, heavy, still bolted to the wall like always, still casting back the room with unsettling precision. Her grandmother had warned her about it, for years. Amelia stood before it now, not quite ready to look too closely. But she would. She didn't plan to remove the mirror that day. The plan, if there was one, had been to sort through drawers, maybe gather a few papers, maybe clean the kitchen floor. Nothing more. But the mirror stayed in her mind like a pebble in her shoe. A quiet discomfort. Something slightly out of place. Her grandmother's rule had always been clear. Don't touch the mirror. She never explained why. It was one of many rules in the house, most of which faded with time. But not that one. That one stayed. Even as a teenager, Amelia had obeyed it. Not because she believed something would happen, but because of how her grandmother said it. Low voice. Eyes fixed. Not afraid. Exactly. But firm. Now, standing alone in the quiet bedroom, Amelia stared at it longer than usual. The mirror was large, too large for the small room. Its frame was carved wood, dark and ornate, the kind of thing you rarely saw anymore. It didn't match the rest of the furniture. She stepped closer. Dust had gathered along the edges. It felt colder here, near the mirror. She told herself it was just the draft. The decision came slowly, not out of rebellion, not even out of curiosity. It was more like a soft nudge from somewhere inside. She retrieved the toolbox from the hallway, found a flathead screwdriver, sat cross-legged on the carpet like she had as a child. The bolts were old. Some paint had covered the heads over the years. The first one took time. The second came loose more easily. By the third, her hands had started to tremble, not from fear, but from something less clear. She paused often, listening, as if someone might walk in. But the house remained still. When the final bolt dropped to the floor, the mirror leaned forward slightly. She steadied it with both hands. It was heavier than she expected. She eased it down slowly, resting it across the bed. The bedsheets wrinkled beneath its weight. Where the mirror had been, the wall looked different. A rectangle of cleaner paint, smooth, undisturbed, except her fingers traced the outline. There was a seam. Amelia stepped back. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe just old wallpaper. But this felt like something deliberate. She touched the edge again, pressed lightly. It gave way. A small panel, hidden flush with the wall, creaked open by half an inch. The air behind it was colder, staler. She opened it further. A dark space revealed itself, just large enough to step through. There was a ladder, metal and narrow, leading down. Amelia didn't go in, not yet. She crouched and shone her phone light inside. The beam revealed concrete walls, dust hanging in the air like breath. A room waited down there. It wasn't just a crawl space. It had depth and intention. She closed the panel, gently, set the mirror upright against the wall, sat back on the bed and looked at her hands. They were shaking. Not from fear, not exactly, but something had shifted. The rule had been broken. The space had been found. And whether she was ready or not, something buried had started to come up. The mirror hadn't just reflected. It had guarded. And whatever it guarded was still waiting. The next morning, she didn't make coffee. She didn't sweep the kitchen floor like she had planned. She stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the closed door of her grandmother's bedroom. The mirror leaned silently beside it now, reflecting nothing but the dull light from the hall. It didn't seem like it belonged anywhere else. And yet, it didn't seem right just sitting there either. Amelia opened the door quietly, as if someone inside might still be sleeping. Of course. The room was empty, exactly as she'd left it. She crossed to the hidden panel, knelt, and opened it again. The air that greeted her was still and cold, not musty, not rotting, just old. She stared at the ladder for a while, then lowered one foot onto the top rung. The metal creaked under her weight. She descended slowly, each step careful, measured. It wasn't deep, maybe 12 feet. The bottom opened into a small room, square, concrete, dry. Her flashlight scanned the space. There were shelves lining the walls, boxes, labeled, stacked, neat. At the center sat a small desk, an old lamp, a notebook, a chair. It didn't look like a bunker. It looked like someone had worked here, recently, or at least with care. She stepped closer. Her boots left faint prints in the dust. The shelves weren't filled with food or supplies. They were filled with paper, files, folders, names written in pencil on the tabs, dates. Amelia pulled one out. Inside were clippings, articles about people who had disappeared, not famous, not widely covered, but someone had kept track. There were handwritten notes in the margins, observations, connections. She opened another folder, and another. Different names, different faces, different towns, but all carried the same quiet pattern. They were people who had gone missing, quietly, with little follow-up. Most hadn't even made the front page. On one wall, pinned with small silver tacks, were photos, faces, some blurred, some smiling, some official, others clearly taken from distance. Beneath many were notes. Last seen 4:12. No follow-up reported. Brother contacted local station. Ignored. Amelia turned slowly, in place, flashlight tracing every corner. She didn't know what she was expecting, but it wasn't this. It wasn't a secret room of conspiracy. It was a library of quiet concern, as if someone had been watching a storm slowly roll in, but no one else looked up. She sat in the chair. It wobbled slightly. She opened the notebook on the desk, recognized the handwriting immediately, her grandmother's, No headings, no dates, just short entries. Some were only a sentence, others a full page. Another girl went missing near 3rd and Levy. No coverage, no police presence, pattern holds. Man in brown sedan seen again parked across from playground, 3rd time this month. If something happens to me, look behind the mirror, but only if you're ready to know. Amelia read that one twice, then closed the notebook. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't about paranoia. This wasn't a hidden life. It was a record of what had been seen and what had been ignored. Her grandmother hadn't been afraid of the mirror. She had been afraid of what it covered, and who might one day try to find it. Amelia leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The light from above was faint, but enough to see her breath now. The room felt colder than before. She didn't want to leave, but she didn't want to stay. Eventually, she climbed back up. The mirror was still leaning where she'd left it. She didn't move it again. Not yet. She closed the panel, gently, then returned to the living room and sat on the couch. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt still. Something had shifted, not just beneath the floor, but inside her. That night, Amelia didn't sleep. She lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to the soft whir of its movement. The notebook sat on the coffee table in front of her, closed, but not forgotten. Every so often, she glanced toward the hallway, toward the bedroom, toward the mirror. The house had always felt like a place of quiet rules. Now it felt like it had simply been guarding something too heavy to carry in plain sight. In the morning, she opened the notebook again. The pages didn't seem like a diary. They read more like field notes, observations, timelines, warnings. There were no mentions of family, no mentions of Amelia. And yet, everything in the room below, everything behind the mirror felt like it had been saved for her. She made tea, carried the mug to the dining room table and sat down with the notebook. The steam curled upward, soft and aimless. Page by page, she moved slowly. She began to see her grandmother not as she had remembered, but as someone else entirely. Not cold, not strict, just watchful. There were entries going back more than 20 years, each one short, but purposeful. House 3 doors down, second fire in 2 years. Official report says faulty heater. No record of first fire. Boy missing. Mother says he never arrived at tutoring. Police closed case within 36 hours. Received call. Same voice. No caller ID. Breathing. Then silence. Some were more personal. I asked Mrs. Nguyen if she remembered the man in the gray coat. She changed the subject. Didn't look me in the eye. They know I'm watching. I feel it in the silence between knocks. Amelia stopped there. She remembered how, even as a child, her grandmother sometimes paused before answering the door, peered through the curtain, listened first. At the time, it had seemed eccentric, a habit, maybe age. But now, it felt deliberate, measured. She thought about all the times she had pushed away from the house, eager to grow up, to leave the quiet behind. The rules, the routines, and how her grandmother had never tried to stop her, never held her back, only reminded her to keep your eyes open. It had felt like a vague saying. Now it sounded like a warning. Amelia went to the hallway closet, pulled out the dusty boxes she had once ignored. Inside were envelopes, receipts, letters, and a stack of maps. Each one was marked with faded circles. Dates, short phrases written in the corners. Last seen, unexplained fire, unreported sound. The same handwriting? Her grandmother hadn't been chasing a mystery. She had been documenting something that no one else seemed willing to see, and she had done it alone. Amelia sat on the floor with the maps spread around her. The morning sun came through the front windows. It landed on one map in particular, a small neighborhood 2 towns over. In the corner, her grandmother had written, 4 gone in 5 years, only 1 reported. Nothing followed up. Amelia stared at the page for a long time, then folded it carefully and set it aside. She didn't know what she was supposed to do yet. But she knew she couldn't put the mirror back. Not as it had been. Something had been kept quiet too long, and now it had surfaced. She thought again about the way her grandmother always looked tired. Not physically, not the kind of tired that sleep fixes, but something else, something carried, silently. Amelia had always thought of her as someone who didn't talk much, someone who didn't explain herself. Now she understood. Explaining would have required being believed, and sometimes being believed came too late. She placed the maps back in the box, closed the notebook, and walked to the back porch. The air smelled of damp leaves and soil. She looked out across the yard. The fence sagged. The garden was overrun. The oak tree cast its familiar shadow. Nothing had changed. And yet everything had. She stood there for a long time, hands in her pockets, not thinking, just noticing, just trying to see things the way her grandmother had. Quietly, patiently, with eyes wide open. By the end of the week, the house no longer felt like a place of mourning. It didn't feel like home either. It felt like a threshold. Amelia sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open again. This time not to read, but to sort. She had laid out folders, one by one, each labeled in her grandmother's handwriting. The handwriting was steady, precise, almost clinical. She imagined her grandmother sitting here at this same table years ago, doing exactly what she was doing now. Not for recognition, not for closure, just because someone had to. What unsettled her most wasn't what was written. It was how little of it had ever been acted on. Names, dates, missing persons, unexplained activity, crossed out leads. It was a map of things no one wanted to carry, so her grandmother carried them alone. But now it wasn't hers to carry anymore. Amelia didn't call the police. She wasn't sure what she'd even say. I found a hidden room under my grandmother's bedroom, and it has proof that something's wrong. It didn't feel like something law enforcement would understand or believe. Instead, she opened her laptop. She hadn't used it in days. There were emails from work, messages from friends. She ignored them. She searched for names she remembered from the notebook. A few were missing person cases, barely documented. Some didn't show up at all. But one name led her to a small community blog, an article, 3 years old. It mentioned a family who had gone quiet after filing complaints. No follow-up, no photographs, just a comment section full of unanswered questions. Amelia copied the link and saved it. Then she searched again, this time for something different. She typed in, "How to report a public records concern anonymously." She scrolled slowly. Most results were vague. Some seemed official. Others didn't feel safe. Then she found a name she recognized. A journalist? Independent? Local? She remembered her grandmother mentioning the name in one of the entries. Might be the only one paying attention. Amelia clicked through to a website. Clean. Simple. No pop-ups. Just a contact page and a short statement. "If no one else will listen, I will." She hesitated, then wrote a message. It wasn't dramatic, just simple. "I think I have something you'll want to see. My grandmother kept records. A lot of them. I found them after she passed. I'm not sure what to do next." She signed only her first name, included no address, then waited. The next morning, there was a reply. "Tell me where to meet you. I'll bring a recorder and a notebook. That's all." The message wasn't emotional, no urgency, no assumptions, just presence, like someone already familiar with long silences and hidden things. Amelia sat back in her chair. She looked around the house. It wasn't ready. She wasn't ready. But the story had started moving, with or without her permission. She walked to the mirror, still leaned against the wall. She touched the frame, then stepped back. The panel was still closed. But now, she knew it wasn't a secret anymore, just a responsibility. Later that day, she opened a box labeled only with one word, unsure. Inside were clippings with no notes, photographs with no names, empty envelopes. And at the very bottom, a sealed letter. Amelia turned it over. No address, no stamp, just her name. Handwritten. Her chest tightened. She didn't open it yet. She held it. Read the name again. For a moment, the house was quiet, not in a heavy way, but in a way that felt like breath before a step forward. There was more to understand, more to ask, more to carry. But now she wasn't alone in the knowing, and that made all the difference. The envelope sat unopened on the desk for 2 days. Not because she forgot about it, but because she wanted to be ready. If such a thing were possible. In the meantime, Amelia cleaned the front porch. Not deeply, just enough to sit there. Her grandmother used to do that every evening. Never rushed. Just watching the street. Sometimes with tea, sometimes with silence. Amelia did the same now. She sat in her grandmother's chair with her own mug of tea, watching as the world continued to pass by. Nothing outside looked different. Same broken sidewalk, same tree leaning slightly into the power lines. But she noticed more. The neighbors who avoided eye contact. The car that passed slowly twice. The way the mail always arrived 5 minutes earlier on Fridays. She was beginning to pay attention in a new way, not from fear, not yet, but with an awareness that wasn't there before. The journalist arrived quietly, a woman in her 40s, unassuming, no camera, no press badge, just a notebook and a phone with the voice recorder already open. They sat at the dining table. Amelia didn't try to explain everything. She simply walked her through it. The mirror, the panel, the room below. Then, the notebooks, the files, the boxes. The journalist said very little, only nodded, only asked small questions. Did your grandmother talk about this to anyone else? No. Do you think someone else knew she was watching? Amelia paused. I think some people knew, but I don't think they knew how much she saw. They sat together in silence for a while after that. The recorder still running, the tea growing cold. Finally, the journalist said, she didn't just leave you a story. She left you a position. Amelia looked up. I'm not like her. No, the woman replied. But you're still here, and that's something. That night, Amelia opened the envelope. It wasn't long, just a few lines, written in the same steady hand that filled all the notebooks. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm sorry for not telling you sooner. But I needed you to live without it for a while. Because now, if you choose to return, it will be your own choice. Amelia read the letter twice, then folded it back along its creases. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply placed it in a small wooden box on the nightstand, beside the Bible, beside the glasses, and left it there. In the days that followed, she began organizing the files. Not to make sense of them, they already made sense, in their own way. She organized them so someone else could understand, if needed. Color-coded folders, typed summaries, maps scanned and backed up. She wasn't trying to solve anything. She was simply tending, stewarding, like someone caring for a garden they didn't plant, but knew not to let die. Amelia walked the neighborhood more often now, not out of routine, out of attention. She noticed which houses had lights on late, which ones didn't. She noticed who waved, and who didn't. She didn't judge, she just noticed, Eventually, she moved the mirror. She rehung it on the wall in the hallway, not to hide anything, but because it had once been a barrier, and now it was something else. A reminder that seeing clearly and choosing to look weren't always the same. By the end of the month, she was still living in the house. Her job had emailed again. She hadn't replied. Somewhere along the way, she had become someone different, not louder, not braver, but quieter in a more deliberate way. And maybe that was a kind of strength too. The journalist kept in touch. She hadn't published anything yet, said she was still thinking, still watching. Amelia understood. Some stories needed time. Some truths took longer to carry. She didn't push. She just kept reading, sorting, preserving. She no longer thought of the house as her grandmother's, and not quite as her own. It was something in between, a space made for keeping things safe until someone was ready to see them. There were still rooms in the house she hadn't fully opened. Not because they were locked, but because she hadn't needed to, not yet. The attic, the old sewing room, the basement no one ever used. Each space waited in its own way, quiet, patient. Some days, Amelia would pause in the hallway, hand on the doorknob, then walk past. She didn't feel rushed anymore. The urgency had passed, or maybe it had shifted into something slower, more intentional. One morning, she brought a chair out to the backyard. The grass was taller than it should have been. She made no plans to cut it. Instead, she sat beneath the old tree, the same one her grandmother used to sit under when Amelia was small. Back then, she hadn't understood why someone would want to just sit. Now, she did. The silence wasn't empty. It was observant, like the air itself was listening. The letter stayed in the wooden box by the bed. Sometimes she would open it again, not to reread the words, but to feel the presence of them. They weren't instructions. They weren't explanations. They were permission, and that was enough. The journalist eventually published a small piece. Not an exposé, not a headline, just a quiet story. About a woman who watched when no one else did, who kept notes when no one asked her to, who noticed what others ignored. It didn't name names, didn't accuse, but it left questions and space for more. Amelia read it once, then printed a copy and placed it in the filing cabinet, with the others. She started receiving letters, handwritten, sometimes typed, mostly from people she didn't know. Some thanked her grandmother, some shared their own memories of strange events, small things that had never made sense. Others asked if she was going to continue the work. She never replied, not because she didn't care, but because the work didn't need to be declared. It only needed to be done. One evening, just before dusk, she walked through the house slowly, room by room, touching objects she hadn't touched in years. The edge of the kitchen table where her schoolbooks once rested. The windowsill where the light always lingered at sunset. The spot on the floor where the radio used to hum in the mornings. She didn't feel like a visitor anymore, and she didn't feel like a child returning home. She felt like a keeper of time, of memory, of silence that had meaning. She rehung the mirror in the front hallway, not to hide anything, and not to display it either. It sat there now like a window one that didn't show the world behind you, but rather asked, "Are you ready to look again?" Some visitors glanced into it and turned away quickly. Some didn't notice it at all. But a few stood longer, curious, unsure. And Amelia always noticed. She always knew who was still learning how to look. There were no dramatic changes in the town, no major arrests, no headlines that altered the world overnight. But small things happened. People asked better questions. A neighbor who never spoke before now waved each morning. A closed storefront reopened, and someone started posting flyers for community meetings. No one said these things were connected, but Amelia suspected her grandmother would have noticed, would have drawn a small line between them. One night, Long after the last letter arrived, Amelia sat on the front porch again. The wind moved gently through the trees. The house creaked as it always had. She sipped her tea, watched the sidewalk, listened to the quiet, not waiting for anything, just staying aware, the way her grandmother had. And she thought, for the first time, that maybe the house hadn't just been a witness, maybe it had been teaching her. Not with words, but with rhythm, with stillness, with careful presence. Amelia stayed until the porch light clicked on. Automatic, faint yellow. She rose slowly, stepped inside, and closed the door behind her. The mirror caught the motion just for a second. Then the hallway was still again. The house said nothing, but it didn't need to. It watched, as it always had. And now, so did she. Amelia never asked for responsibility. She didn't seek out hidden rooms or unsolved stories. But life handed her something quiet and unfinished, and she chose to stay with it. Not to fix it, not to prove anything, but to understand. In a world that rewards noise, her grandmother chose silence, not out of weakness, but because some truths grow best in stillness. There was no grand ending, no public honor, just shelves of paper, years of quiet watching, and a mirror that had guarded more than reflection. Amelia learned that keeping watch really watching is not a passive act. It's a kind of courage. And sometimes the strongest work is the kind no one sees. Thanks for staying until the end. If this story stayed with you, you're welcome to subscribe. We share more quiet stories like this, the kind that don't shout, but don't leave you either. And if it reminded you of something, you can share it in the comments. Sometimes quiet voices echo the longest.